Perfect.
So you can.
Okay, it's on now, so we're good.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I think we should go ahead and begin. I'd like to welcome everyone to this special, what I see as both a religious studies and a South Asia event. And we'll be enjoying a talk by Keith Cantú, who's a doctoral student in religious studies at UCSB, and he'll receive his doctoral degree this spring. And Keith is a specialist in South Asian religions, and his talk today will draw on his dissertation, which he recently filed, and it's entitled Sri Sabhapati Swami and the Translocalization of Śivarājayoga. And this is a quite hefty, weighty, we could say, over nearly 600-page tome that was recently filed. And it's an incredible study. A number of us here had the good fortune of being on the dissertation committee and to probe into this amazing study. And so Keith's study, what it does is it examines the Tamil, pan-Indian, and international reception of Sabapati's system of yoga, which spans multiple linguistic and cultural worlds. And it also includes theosophy and the works of other modern occult authors who were interested in yoga and then were part of the audience to receive this system of yoga internationally. So I'll allow, kind of step back now and allow Keith to carry on and share with us his insights from this incredible study that he's recently finished.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you to all of you who attended. And I see some UCSB faculty as well. Thanks, David, for showing up, and for Juan as well. Appreciated your support on the South Asian Islam front. So yeah, it's my honor to present back to UCSB on this topic, and I think it's probably best if we just dive right in. So let me see, I'll share my screen. Okay, are we all good? Can we all see that okay? Okay. Say what, sorry? Okay. So this talk is entitled Sri Sabhapati Swami and the Translocalization of Śivarājayoga. And I'm going to be talking or presenting this talk in a more conversational format, going through the slides and the topics at hand. And so for any details, I'll encourage you to consult the dissertation and read sort of the citations and the source material that way, since it's all there. But I wanted to sort of give you a visual journey through some of this material as well. So, and part of this is predicated upon an idea that a history of yogis opens the way for an analysis of the extremely rich body of narrative accounts. And this is an insight that David White, my advisor, had. And I kind of took that and ran with it in terms of what can a deep exploration of a single yogi really reveal, to us about the history and the narrative accounts that surround that history. Even if a lot of it can be hagiographical, it's still possible to understand and integrate some of the history as well. And so in this talk, I'm going to start with the historical background, the context of Sabapati's life and social engagement, including his literature and visual diagrams in numerous prestige and Indian vernacular languages, and then the role of Śaiva yogic cosmology and perspectives on Hinduism and other religions. And then I'll shift to theories of translocalization, mesolocalization, and localization as useful models for apprehending the full scope of Sabapati's work. So let's start with Sabapati's life and literature. So the accounts for Sabapati's life are spread throughout different published sources. And one account is what I like to call the Ur account, published in 1880, which is in English. And it was later sort of reprinted in 1884 with Tamil and Devanagari script for some of the city and place names and technical terms as well. This was also translated into Urdu. And there are expanded accounts of Sabapati's life in Tamil editions of his work as well, which are different from this Ur account. And they're also different works entirely from his works that are published in English, which we'll get into in a little bit. And these two accounts, which I call T1 and T2, so Tamil 1 and Tamil 2, really go into a lot more detail of, I would say, the Tamil cultural context, as well as some of the temples that he visited, and the terminology used is really useful to compare to the English material. And you'll see how that kind of interweaves into the narrative today. So Sabapati was born in Chennai, right, which was then called Madras in British India. And you can see that it's South India. And we'll return to this map too, which gives you the main railroad routes in 1883. So you can kind of get a sense of places and the potential for travel. And so he was born specifically in Velachery, which today, those of you who have visited Chennai will know that it's close to the international airport of Chennai and also the IIT Madras. And so it's a sort of a tech hub as well. But at that time, it was just a very small temple village to the southwest of Madras and sort of the colonial centers, Fort St. George. And you know, down here you had Adyar and all of that as well. So he was educated at Free Church Mission School in the 1860s. And this was a missionary school that was first associated with the Church of Scotland. And then sort of there was a schism and they broke, but the missionary school still remained. And there he received, you know, education in English through reading the Bible and other texts. But he later, as he grew up, he started to embark on travels, and both of the accounts refer to him visiting the Nagore Dargah, which is in outside Nagapattinam, sort of the southeast India and south of Chennai. And here there's a shrine to a sheikh named Sheikh Hamid Naguri. And so there is sort of a living presence too of fakirs who still live at this site, who likely at that time even more so had an interest in yoga. And so there is some interesting cross pollination happening there. And there's also records that he was married and that he went with his father-in-law on textile business to Rangoon, sort of in Burma. So that's another sort of exploration, and that's incorporated into his hagiography as encounters with Buddhist monks and conversations that he would have had there. But what starts to happen is that at the age of 29, he starts to have some midlife crisis of sorts, and he desires a practical experience. The hagiographies tell us of the divine, of Brahman. In some texts, it's Sarveshvara, sort of as a form of Shiva. And the accounts agree that he had a dream, and this dream led him to Vedashreni Dandishvara Koil, this temple. And in this temple, he sat day and night in meditation, and eventually was convinced that he needed to go to the Augusta Ashram. And the hagiographies don't really tell us where the Augusta Ashram is, but if you look in the text and sort of dive into the geographical locations as well as the diagrams, then you start to see that this is actually a specific place that Sabapati would have known about and been familiar with through conversation or otherwise. So here's some more modern images of Vedashreni Dandishvara, where he had this vision of Shiva. And one thing too, around Velachery, there is a Jiva Samadhi or tumulus to Sabapati's guru, Chidambara Swamigal. And even though it's archaically transliterated here in the Tamil works, you have sort of, I guess, quote unquote, correct spellings, right? Since that's the language where his name would be primarily rendered. And so what you have here is a trail that leads back through textual sources from Chidambara Swamigal to a reformer named Kumaradeva, who lived in around the 17th century. And if you travel to Chennai today, to Velachery, you'll still see that Chidambara Swamigal's tumulus, or Jiva Samadhi, is still extant. And there is a guru currently at the site, who does offer training in yoga and yogic techniques. And they were very helpful to me in sort of tracking down some of the contexts for Sabapati's works. And it's sort of linked to also the siddhas, which we'll get into a little bit. And Chidambara Periya Swamigal also authored a work called Upadesa Ummai, which is known as the Truth of Instruction, and had, as I alluded to earlier, his own sort of parampara with in the line of Kumaradeva, and his guru Kolondaival Swami also has a tumulus that I was able to visit, and it's still sort of frequented by devotees to this day. And this provides additional context for Sabapati's teachings and works in Tamil, since he would have known this guru and engaged directly with Vedashreni Chidambara Swamigal. Now the accounts agree that he took a vow of sannyasa from Chidambara Swamigal. And after becoming a sannyasi, he traveled to the southwest. And as I alluded to earlier, there are some locations that are mentioned in his accounts, like Saturagiri, Kutralam, and Papanasam, that lead directly to the Augusta Ashram that is mentioned. And so all of these sites are notable for being important to the Tamil Siddhas, which are a group of Śaiva yogis, alchemists, ascetics, singers, who were known for their devotion as well as their sort of expertise in these modes of meditation and yoga. And a lot of them lived, and to some extent still lived, as they've been kind of absorbed into this group known as Swamigals. They've been absorbed, they're known for living near waterfalls or rivers or places in nature. And so it would be a natural kind of place for Sabapati to go to experience this kind of transformative yoga, really. I mean, he was looking for a samadhi, and we'll get into that in a second. So one of the first places that he went to was Papanasa Temple, which you can see is near a river called Thamirabadani. And this river is held to be sacred by the inhabitants who frequent it. And you can see that it was also sacred to Sabapati, since in one of his books, he has a diagram that mentions Sivajnana Bodha Rishi, Augusta Rishi, and Guru Pita Rishi. So that's Sabapati Swami's later title. And you have mention of the Thamirabadani Ara, which means river in Tamil. And it's sort of like a sangam, a triveni. It's mentioned as a triveni of sorts that kind of mirrors the triveni at Prayagraj, right, with the Yamuna and Saraswati rivers. So here he has his own triveni, and this sort of provides a lot of context for the mythical geography of Augusta's ashram that Sabapati was looking for in the dream to obtain this samadhi. And so if you go there today, you'll still see that there are a presence of sadhus who still live by the river. And so it's, very possible that Sabapati would have traveled this way along his route. And if you look at sort of archival evidence and maps of that period, then you'll see that there were a network of small paths that were leading up to the Agastya Malai, which is Augustus Mountain. And this mountain was the site of Augustus Ashram, which seems to have been either a semi-mythical or also sort of a real site where yogis lived who sort of participated in the mythos of Augustus Ashram. And if you travel there today, you'll see that there are rock carvings here, and there's a place called Kalyana Tirtham, which celebrates Agastya and his consort Lopamudra, who at that time that I visited was covered. And you even have rock carvings of Agastya. And further down in this waterfall area, you have carvings of Krishna as well, and so sort of several other deities. And so this kind of lends its support to this area as being a site for Indian alchemists as well. Since Augustus sort of a multifaceted figure known for, being an origin of the Tamil language as well as a great alchemist. And so here's a depiction in one of Sabapati's works that shows male and female yogis of Augustus Ashram. And you can kind of see, what was imagined here. And these are actually Tamil numbers that connect. You can't see on the side to sort of a numbered diagram. So in all of his works, there are these labels, right, where the pictures are very neatly labeled, and you can sort of, map on what is what thing. You don't have to really guess, which is, I think, a really important aspect to his work. So what we see with this story is that in the Tamil account, we note that he was in a cave, and while eating bulbs, roots, and so on, he received all the instructions, upadesango, from Upadesha, and he experienced all the rites, or sadhanas. He obtained all the experiences, and then having refuted all these through his guidance, through his guru's guidance, his individuated non-dual self was united to Brahman by the experience of the steadfast composure in Brahman, Brahmanishtai Samadhi Anubhavam, which is the yoga of kings for Shiva as Brahman. So you have sort of a, Shiva being mapped onto the Brahman in his works, which is especially the case in his English works that sort of elide Shiva and focus on Brahman. But in the Tamil works, you have Shiva sort of more pronounced. And then we have this idea of Siva Brahma Raja Yoga, which is Śivarājayoga, which we'll return to in a second, equated with a kind of samadhi. So after this experience way down south, this is where things really start to get interesting and take us far outside of Tamil Nadu. We have accounts that he desired to leave, and his guru gave him permission to sort of take these teachings in stock hagiographical fashion, but take these teachings to, the rest of India and the world, really. I mean, he didn't see himself just limited to India. But he started by traveling to Kedarnath, Muktinath, as well as Pashupatinath in Nepal, and was known to interact with the yogis and sadhus at these locations as well. And so I'm sure his students would have asked him about his experiences. So it's, on the one hand, we can say, okay, no one could really have traveled to all of these places, but at the same time, his students would have asked him. So it's very likely, I would think, that he had experiences in North India at these temple sites, at least a few of them, if not all of them. But what we know for sure is that he did end up in Lahore by the year 1879 into 1880. And we know that from some publications. The first known of his publications that show up here in English, which is Vedantic Raja Yoga, or a treatise on Vedanta and Raja Yoga. And here's a sort of map that we'll return to of his texts. And this alpha stream here are his works in English that have transliterated terms in Sanskrit. And you'll see how they kind of intersect in a second. But these works were published first out of Lahore, right? And later there was a Bengali translation published out of Kolkata. But here we have some of the earliest of his works that were published. And as well, this stream was what was published into German, which we'll get into in the translocalization segment. Now, some of the records that we have of Sabapati in Lahore are linked to the founders of the Theosophical Society, which was founded in 1875 in New York City. But Henry Olcott and Helena Blavatsky had traveled to India, as is well known, and were lecturing in Lahore. And while lecturing there, they met Sabapati Swami, and they had a conversation and a meeting. And Sabapati recounted this dream that he had, or actually a vision of flying to Mount Kailasha, the abode of Shiva. But he recounted this experience in vivid terms, as if he was actually physically flying. And so, as the story goes, Henry Olcott really couldn't believe that this was the case, and there was a sort of falling out, or a lack of support that started to happen. But at the same time, there is evidence that Helena Blavatsky and Henry Olcott maintained a friendship with Sabapati to some degree, and continued to promote his work, as is evident in lectures that Henry Olcott gave, as well as Sabapati Swami's a letter that was published in a newspaper. So here you have an address. This is from Henry Olcott's personal diary that's held at the Theosophical Society archives in Adyar, that show his meeting, and it's also published in his old diary leaves, although the old diary leaves out some details that can only be found in the handwritten diary. And there's also this letter that I mentioned was published in a newspaper, an open letter by the Madras yogi Sabapati Swami about his meeting with Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott at Lahore. And in this meeting, he's very praising of Helena Blavatsky and sort of her understanding of the yogis and the siddhas. He doesn't mention Henry Olcott as much, but it's interesting that there was this favorable opinion of sorts. And this was while Sabapati was staying in the Kangra Valley. Another historical record that we have of Sabapati in Lahore during this time is with John Campbell Oman, who published these works on the sadhus of India. He called it the mystics, ascetics, and saints. And while a lot of his perspectives, are very sort of Orientalist in nature, it's interesting because he was born in Kolkata, and the records imply that he was of sort of a Eurasian descent, and sort of had a different perspective than most of the other colonial authorities of that period. And he was a teacher of biology and of sciences to what became Sabapati's editor, Sri Chandra Boshu. And Sri Chandra Boshu was a Bengali expat whose father had immigrated to Lahore from Bangladesh, what is today Bangladesh. And Sri Chandra Boshu, his father died when I think he was 6. And, he was raised by his mother, but had sort of an education based on sort of the Bengali community there and their support. He was able to get into Government College Lahore and have John Campbell Oman as a teacher. And Sri Chandra Boshu later became interested in publishing works on yoga and in Sanskrit after having a childhood experience with a Nath yogi that sort of, pushed a positive impression of yoga, I guess, in his heart and mind. And Sri Chandra Boshu also corresponded with Max Mueller, who even mentions Sabapati Swami in his work, the 6 systems of Indian philosophy, or something like that, that's in my dissertation there. But Sri Chandra Boshu and his interaction and his context is a whole other talk, so I can't get into him, but suffice to say, he becomes a very important part of Sabapati Swami's publishing in English until he kind of leaves the scene by about 1884, 1885. We don't really hear about Sri Chandra Boshu and his involvement with Sabapati Swami anymore. And that's because Sabapati Swami is onto that, new things here. And as just a side note, we have here, Lahore was also sort of an important melting pot for ideas and intersections between yoga and occultism during this time. And you had Rama Prasad Kashyap, who published Occult Science, the Science of Breath, which is sort of an interpretation of this circa 12th century Śaiva text, the Śivarājayoga. And Magdalena Kreller, who I think was in the audience, she's written a little bit on this text. And he was an associate with Sri Chandra Boshu, Sabapati's editor, and I'm sure there was some conversations that were had, you know, as they interacted on these topics, but that's sort of another interesting tidbit here. What happens though is Sabapati leaves Lahore. We don't really know when. One of the second accounts say that he stayed there about 6 months, but he ends up traveling back to Madras, Chennai. And we know this because he publishes what I'm calling this sort of hybrid stream here that mixes the English works with some material from Devanagari and then also some material in Tamil. So it's actually a trilingual work that, you know, it contains a wealth of material, and it's really useful for interpreting some of the archaically transliterated terms that Sabapati uses. And this work is called Om, the Cosmic, Psychological, Spiritual Philosophy and Science of Communion with and Absorption in the Holy and Divine Infinite Spirit. So here you can, you know, have that mouthful here, but it's a two-part work that does survive in a few libraries, including the British Library and some places in India. And you can tell by its tone that it's trying to bridge and trying to do a lot of things in terms of bringing together yoga, a Tamil version of yoga, in conversation with sort of English terminology. There's some interesting marks of Hegelian philosophy in here with the infinite spirit and all of that. But what we have here at the same time, though, is we have another work that shows much more of a Tamil influence happening, published around the same time in between these first and second books. And this work is Sarvopadesa Tattvajnana Śivarājayoga Svaya Pramadjnananubhuti Veda Bodham, right? So it's the similar title to this one here. You can see it transliterated Vedanta Śivarājayoga Brahmajnana-Anubhuti, right? So it's clear that these works were kind of intersecting, but they came from a different starting point. And this work, there are only a few copies that are at Om Prakash's ashram in Uti, Uddagamangalam. And here, there's sort of a wealth of information. As I noted, there's one of Sabapati's Tamil accounts that's still in this work, as well as vividly illustrated diagrams, many of which appear to have been illustrated by a Telugu artist, because he signs his name in Telugu. Sabapati then moves to Mumbai, right? So he's kind of always on the move. And there's a mention, which I won't get too much into, of him visiting the Augusta Ashram again to catch this vision of Augusta that happens once every 50 years. But after that happens, he travels to Mumbai. And we do know historically that he was there, since we have sort of theosophical periodicals from that area that mention him lecturing on Raja Yoga there. And he must have had some students who were very interested in publishing his work there as well, because we have sort of this Hindustani, you know, and by Hindustani, I mean sort of a language, a world that incorporates, you know, Urdu as well as sort of Sanskritic terms, right, into, you know, what later became modern Hindi and modern Urdu. And we have this work, which is much more on the Sanskrit side of Hindustani, I would say. And this is Raja Yoga Brahmajnan Anubhuti Sangraha Ved, or Veda. And here we have sort of many of Sabapati's ideas in Tamil reflected here in Hindi, very Sanskritized Hindi, that his audience in North India could readily read. And then finally, these last publications that are happening here are related to new developments that are happening in the Tamil scene as Sabapati, as I noted earlier, his earlier editor, Sri Chandraboshu, had kind of left the scene. He had left Mumbai and come back to South India and started to really amass followers, specifically in Tamil Nadu, who were interested in his teachings and writings, and especially ritual instructions, mantras for different gods and goddesses, how to celebrate certain holidays, sort of more the technical aspects of puja and all of that, that life and world there. And if what I was able to do in the dissertation is using descriptions of where to go, which railway station to get off of, and where to go to actually speak and meet with Sabapati Swami. And then also comparing that with village maps that I was able to obtain in Chepauk. They have a land surveyor office where you can request these village maps. It's quite a process, and you need a lot of permissions and going to different offices. But finally, I was able to get these village maps that show land survey numbers and pretty conclusively show the extant site of what used to be Sabapati's meditation hall. He called his Madalayam's meditation hall. It's sort of like a mata or an ashram for yoga. And here there is still an extant temple called Sri Sabhapati Swami Lingeshwara. And I was able to meet the presiding Swami of this temple, Hariharan Swamigal, who in an interview sort of recounted to me the history of Konur Ramalinga Swamigal, who's mentioned in Sabapati Swami's literature. So there's a direct connection there of Ramalinga Swamigal being a student of Sabapati. This is different from Chidambara Ramalinga Swamigal, who several authors have written on. I think Richard Weiss and Srilata Raman is preparing a book related to Chidambara Ramalinga Swamigal, but this is Konur Ramalinga Swamigal, who is specifically mentioned as Sabapati's student. And his student was Ananda Swamigal, who apparently came from Kerala. And they sort of continued the life of this tumulus after Sabapati Swami left. And I was grateful to interview Subramanian Chettiar, who knew Ramalinga Swamigal as just a little child, but his father knew him very well, and they worked together in sort of the institutions of the temple down in, I want to say Murugambagam. I'm forgetting the town where Ramalinga Swamigal has his tumulus, but it basically southwest of Chennai. And Vinayagam, who still is there and very active in the Sabapati Lingeshwara foil scene. They have a WhatsApp group that I'm a member of, and I constantly am able to see lots of scenes that are very similar to what Sabapati sort of initially imagined in a way, and it's very interesting. So here we have a diagram on the students and community carrying out the instructions of the guru, and this is from Sabapati's last full work published completely in Tamil. There are a few pages that are specifically for English devotees, but the balance of the book is entirely in Tamil. And you see that there are these activities that are happening around the shrine. And I was interested to see in the WhatsApp group, there was a session of yoga even recently held by a visiting guru at Sri Sabhapati Lingeshwara. And so you can kind of see that inside here, some of the practices and the ideas of sort of collective participation in meditation and yoga still do go on, as well as singing and music, which I go into more in my dissertation. And then lastly, Sabapati's works lived on in Om Prakash Swami, who would require a whole other presentation as well. And some of Sabapati's books still survive in his library, which is outside Uti. So I want to get in a little bit to the Śaiva cosmology, although I see that we are, let's see, about 30 minutes in, is that right? So 25 minutes. So, sorry, what?
Go ahead. You take the time you need. That's fine.
Okay. Okay. So in Sabapati's works, there are kind of three main types of yoga: Hatha Yoga, Hatha Raja Yoga, and Śivarājayoga. And what's interesting, and I alluded to this earlier, is Śivarājayoga is a Samadhi. It means this kind of composure that is the royal yoga of Shiva, or for Shiva, and the gnosis of the Brahman. And I'm grateful to David for pointing this out to me, that Samadhi literally means something more like composition. And so I kind of like composure, but he often translates it as communion, right? But that could be sort of a very Vedanta inflected translation in Sabapati's works. But as we'll see, he can't really be framed entirely as a Vedantin. So I like the translation composure here, or composition. And so for Sabapati, Hatha Yoga is this yoga of force, which is linked to the binding of the breath. And then Hatha Raja Yogam is the binding of the breath and the mind. And then Sabapati in his trilingual work also includes a brief consideration of Patanjali Yoga, without reference to Patanjali or the Yoga Sutra. And this is sort of the reference to Patanjali here. And I won't get into the asanas for the sake of time here, but suffice to say, he does prescribe 10 asanas that do relate to a considerable degree to the Shiva Yoga Pradipika, which is a text that a colleague of mine, Seth Powell, has been writing his dissertation about. And he was pointed out to me this correlation here. But most important for us is this third kind of yoga, which is the subjugation of gnosis. And this is the royal yoga for Shiva. And he distinguishes, he says that in Vedanta modes, it can be the nature of unified oneness, whereas in Siddhantika modes of knowledge, it's defined as the dissolution of the Brahman and the self, or the nature of I am a servant, dasoham bhava, the nature of duality and dissolution. And so he's kind of allowing for both worlds. And the methods that he gives for this are sort of very, very practical in a way, right? Shut your eyes and throw the keenness of two sides to the kundali. Imagine the head to be removed and its place occupied by jnana kasha. And if you sort of go through his work, you'll see that, that these instructions start to make a lot of sense in terms of the way that they intersect with his cosmology. And it's important to note here too that he talks about Kundali as the location of the Muladhara, but it's not really Kundalini or this Shakti that rises specifically for Sabapati. It's Prana Kasha, this sort of ether of prana, or the vital breath. Although he does indicate that it rises, this vital breath does rise like a serpent. So there is some kind of correlation, but it's not for him Kundalini that specifically rises. Now, some of the South Indian sources for Sabapati's Śivarājayoga are the Tamil-specific development of Shiva Yoga as a category of Virashaiva Yoga, and that's evident in a work like the Shiva Yoga Pradipika. And these were integrated into Tamil poems and songs like the Sitarganam. And I'm very grateful to Srilata Raman for pointing this out to me, that the earliest mention of this kind of Shiva Yoga or Śivarājayogam in a Tamil work, which predates Sabapati Swami. And there's also this notion of a doctrine of unity, Aikyavadam, that came to occupy an in-between zone between Vedanta and Shaiva Siddhanta. And there's also references to a South India specific idea of a fourfold internal instrument here, which I don't have time to get into, but suffice to say there are interesting cosmological considerations that link Sabapati's works to a South Indian context. So here's sort of some references for you. The Sitarganam by the Troops of Siddhas, composed by the Tamil poet Tayu Manava. And Śivarājayogam still is relevant in Tamil published works today, as you can tell by these works that I was able to obtain sort of paperback from Chennai booksellers. And a lot of these make reference to the Tirumandram, which is a Shaiva compilation of lore and yogic teachings from the medieval period. So Sabapati has this embodied cosmology here with chakras and, you know, a whole host of rays and brightnesses that would take really forever to go into a whole lecture of, you know, how all of these intersect and everything. But suffice to say is that his whole cosmology is embodied in chakras, as well as sort of, you see these A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. These are linked to these 4 spiritual brightnesses and then 16 spiritual rays. So it's very technical in a certain way, right? And they're embodied in these chakras or lotuses. He kind of blends together an idea of like grantas or knots, or adaras and like supports and chakras. For Sabapati, those are sort of all the same, even if they were distinct in sort of earlier medieval tantric works. The chakras are sort of pretty consistent in his works as this list of 12 instead of what, you know, is more popularly known today as like a 6+1 model. And the precedent for some of Sabapati's stages in the Śaiva literature, and this is something that I was really fortunate to learn just in the past year and integrate into the dissertation, is sort of these stages in Tamil Śaiva literature. So Eric Steinschneider has analyzed a text known as the Olivilodicum, the subsiding into annihilation of Kanudaya Vallal, in which the soul comes to shed its ego consciousness and become the Godhead, Sivam Ai. And so several of these stages bear resonance to Sabapati's own formulation of the tattvas, seeing Parai, or the supreme, and also these 10 acts, or the Dasya Karyam, which were elaborated in another Tamil work, the Unmai Neri Vilakam. And these stages were also described in the Tuhularu Bodham, which included a verse on Parayogam, or yoga for the supreme. So there are these sort of precedents, and this is something that I'm still exploring. I haven't really engaged a lot of these primary sources to the degree that I would like, but it's clear that there's a precedent for these stages in Tamil Śaiva literature. And there's also a model for the 3 highest para stages in the head, Paratpara, Parasthana, Tatparasthana, which Sabapati uses. And there's, you know, a similarity here between the 3 Para, Parapara, and Apara, the 3 goddesses in the Kashmir Trika tradition that Alexis Sanderson and others have written on. So, you know, it would be interesting to sort of trace that out more, although there's definitely a resonance. And then Sabapati's engagement with other religions really comes to the fore in his works. And we know that Sabapati separately engaged Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, the Parsi religion, or Zoroastrianism, various societies, Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, Prarthana Samaj, as well as even a paragraph on Theosophical Societies. He's very critically, you know, engaged in some of these doctrinal disputes. He doesn't engage Judaism or Jainism, you know, which is interesting, but his preference for Hinduism was likely based on his belief, and this is evident from his works, that Sanskrit was the oldest language in the world. So there was a belief at that time that Sanskrit was clearly the oldest language. And so since the Vedas were the earliest religious writings, then, you know, Hinduism would have been the earliest religion. And this opinion could have been reinforced by Helena Blavatsky's idea of Sinzar, or the language of the mythical book of Tsian. And James Santucci has an article on this in the volume Imagining the East that might point to this direction. But Sabapati engages these other religions in this rubric of hero, weapons, enemies, ministers, ruling power, spiritual emperor, and so on. And I won't get into all of these, but suffice to say is that different religions sort of fall in these stages or categories. And really only the, you know, the true religions are able, you know, according to Sabapati, are able to fit into this ruling power and spiritual emperor, success of ever being your own self category. And this is through the kind of samadhi that only Śivarājayoga brings. He also critiques atheism, which is interesting. And I won't get too much into the history here for the sake of time, but suffice to say, we had sort of atheism as promoting a mechanistic kind of materialism in works like Système de la Nature by the Baron de Holbach. And I'm grateful to Joe Blankholm in our department here at UCSB for giving me the lowdown on sort of atheism and how it might intersect with Sabapati's writings. But by the time of Sabapati, you had atheism as an affirmation rather than a negation. And Sabapati is clearly engaging people who identify as atheists. And this is, for Sabapati, it's materialists who blindly say and believe that the last creations, or 5 vitals of the last spiritual creation, have the elements themselves to act what God, the infinite spirit, in his second active principle can do. So this could be a blend of Charvaka materialism, which is sort of pre-colonial forms of Indian materialism, mixed with this sort of urban educated atheism that was starting to arise in colonial centers like Madras. But for Sabapati, his critique, you can't separate his critique from his cosmology, since we have this idea of 5 vitals, which are these 5 elements that are then the kundali of elements. So for Sabapati, just denying that there's anything beyond the kundali of elements or the muladhara, is pretty silly. And so it's interesting to sort of compare his cosmology with his opinion, right or wrongly, of what atheism is. And he gives this kind of other set of 5, the stages of atheism as kind of the lowest, dualism or Manichaeanism is sort of, better than atheism, theism, is better than dualism, Vedantism as better than theism, but really the best one is not even Vedantism. It's believing the soul is ever and ever the very universal infinite spirit of the self. And here we have this Aika Brahma Jnana Advaita Madam. So it's interesting to see, how he negotiates this, which seems to be linked to the way that some Tamil Buddha Shaiva movements were also negotiating these middle ways, so to speak, between Vedanta and Saiva Siddhanta. So, and then also as a last note, in a few instances, he uses the adjective psychological, but he never engages modern psychology, since his literature predates Freud and Jung. It's unclear how Sabapati would have felt about atheism if it allowed for opinions on states of consciousness or contemporary neurology. And then Sabapati does engage what Augusta Ashram has called the Victorian naturalistic worldview, and mentions atoms and oxygen and nitrogen. And here they're even integrated in his Tamil works, especially his earliest Tamil work, with sort of these phenomena, with sort of different actions and motions, and with different swarupas, which are sort of these inherent forms of the divine that are part of Sabapati's cosmology as well. Essential natures, inherent natures. So finally, this part is not as long now that we have sort of the background. We have Sabapati's literature as translocalization. And so when I started this research, Sabapati was largely unknown among scholars of South Asian religions, aside from Karl Bayer and a few others, and almost entirely forgotten in India. And I even had to create the Wikipedia article for Sabapati Swami. Some of you may have read already. And so some questions are, what are the reasons for his neglect, both in India and abroad, given all the interconnected histories? Are there similar forgotten figures that are sort of behind the scenes? And then, does a preoccupation with authenticity play a role? Is it more productive to evaluate these intersections in terms of spatialized locality? And the dangers are clear here, because without a rigorous evaluation of the context for Sabapati's local Indic language literature, his teachings are easy to dismiss as, this quote says here, a curious blend of Christianized asceticism and chakra meditation that was quite different from any authentically tantric teaching, of course, but it became acceptable to the Theosophical Society as an unobjectionable treatment of a foreign doctrine. Now, as I go into in my dissertation, this really elides or overlooks all of Sabapati's Tamil-specific Shaiva content, his cosmology, and so on. And this is getting into sort of the idea of translocalization, since Shearer is really engaging Sabapati's translocal literature, I would argue. And this is the way in which Sabapati's yogic literature were translated and circulated through networks that gradually removed them from their original local religious, in this case Tamil context, while never fully eliminating certain distinctive traces of their localized content. And this is adapted from an idea of Alejandro Ros in the Encyclopedia of Global Religion. So other parallel ideas are transculturation, despatialization, as my colleague Raganko Mukhopadhyay has mentioned at a workshop. And here I argue that local is the Tamil reception. Mesolocal, which I introduced here, is a pan-Indian reception. And translocal is an international reception. And the translocal is also relocalized into Bengali here. And you can go back into my dissertation for more on this chart and sort of how I map it for Sabapati's case. And for the local, just to go quick since I think we're out of time, the Tamil Vairshaiva synthesis of Shiva Yoga really is what is characteristic of Sabapati's local material, as well as these other syntheses and yoga texts, mythological materials, and so on. And so this is sort of really, linked to the landscapes of yoga, linked to temple culture, linked to diagrams of Sabapati that depict him in a very Tamilized, way. And, it's interesting, he also makes allowance for female students in his Tamil works, which is really important. And then the translocal, which we don't have time to get into, I would argue is the Theosophy dimension. And then also Aleister Crowley adopted some of Sabapati's writings and teachings into his curriculum of what J. Gordon Melton has called Thelemic magic in America. And this was integrated into an occult instruction that was published in his works in 1909. And there were also other occultists who engaged him, such as Pascal Beverly Randolph, well, not Randolph specifically, but the orders in which he was a part of, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And Patrick Bowen has written about this. There's a wide range of personalities. And also Franz Hartmann, the Neue Lotusblüten. He translated Sabapati's works into German and published them, and linked Sabapati's subtle body material as a kind of astral body or astral cover. And there's sort of a discourse about how to link that together as well. And many of these occultists were interested in sort of seeing parallels between yoga and magic. So Raja Yoga being a kind of white magic, Hatha Yoga as a black magic, Tantra as a kind of sorcery, according to Franz Hartmann. And for Aleister Crowley, which you have down here, you have these different formulae of yoga being linked to the Kabbalah, sort of interpretations based on Jewish and then later Christian and occult interpretations of the Kabbalah that then mapped these forms of yoga onto different sephra of the Kabbalistic tree of life. And then finally, you had New Thought gurus like William Estep, and I'm grateful to Philip Deslett for introducing me to his wild world in the world of newspapers. In the United States, publishing Sabapati's writings in Missouri, and being part of a New Thought movement there. And then what I add here finally is the importance of the mesolocal, which is sort of the pan-Indian dimension here. And you see that Sabapati's writings were disseminated in so many different languages across India. And I think that that's a really important point that should be, more broadly understood, including sort of gods and goddesses, which were mesolocal figures, pan-Indian figures. And then you see in diagrams like this one that are in Tamil and Telugu, but then they're translated into Hindi and Devanagari. And then they're also translated into English. So if you only look at one, you're going to miss sort of the also the translation aspects that happen here as these ideas are what I would call mesolocalized across India. English also being a pan-Indian language, not just an international language in this case. And so my conclusion here is that the importance is to consider multiple locational levels in modern religious history, especially when dealing with 19th century South Asia, let's say. And if we only talk about the local levels, then we're missing the whole global relevance, right? The way that Sabapati's ideas are incorporated into the writings of occultists, other movements, outside of India, how these ideas travel and so on and so on. If we only focus on the translocal though, then we miss the local historical contexts. These are elided, and then these are easy to dismiss with post-Orientalist critique, right? Because, here you have, ideas that are sort of taken up by, non-Indian actors, and the ideas change based on innovative approaches, based on interpretations that might not be tethered, in many cases to the local religious contexts. And then if we only focus on the mesolocal, then we both miss the global and the local variations. And then here we have a danger of framing the history in more nationalistic terms and ignoring regional variations, like between Tamil and Hindi speaking and sort of Bengali regional contexts. So that's my presentation for today. So I thank you for bearing with that, a little bit of the speed of having to get through a lot of material, but thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Keith. Wow, that was quite, there are many students here from Religious Studies 19, and Keith is one of our TAs, and I'm happy to see all of you here. And this just shows you what a true research scholar is. This, the excavation that Keith did in terms of literature, historical sources, ethnographic work, getting maps, local maps. I mean, this is an amazing, really, reconstruction of the life and literature of this relatively neglected modern yogi, and who's very important for our understanding of modern yoga. And that just shows you, there's so many materials in India like this, you were saying, right? There are other figures like this that have been kind of lost sight of, but they're there. But it takes a lot of dedication and a lot of multiple, I mean, in Keith's case, a mastery of multiple language groups and regional contexts and local contexts in order to really master this and put together what an incredible study that already, I think, Keith, you're very modest, but already has a potential publisher, even though he just literally filed it. So we really congratulate you on that. And I'm happy you're able to share this with everyone. And we have time for some questions, discussion.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. I'll start with a question because it's short, and then the comment. In the pen and ink images that you showed us, quite often the yogis have all these accessories in front of them, water pots and so forth, and it's not something I'm familiar with in the iconography of such persons. I mean, okay, sometimes, Tulsi Das has got his one kamandalu, but these guys have a whole array of things. And I just wondered if you know anything about the significance of all of that stuff. Let me give you my comment, and then you can respond to my question.
Okay.
You mentioned his having claimed to have flown to Mount Kailash, something that you wrote about in your dissertation, of course. William Pinch, whose friends know him as VJ, he tells me, he's this wonderful historian of colonial India, and a lot of it's about yogis, that it was only in the 19th century that Kailash became a destination that you could actually walk to. Prior to that, it was Shiva's mountain in some mythical place, but it wasn't on the map of the earth. And then at some point, it became identified with this mountain in Tibet that you could take a pilgrimage to. And I just wonder where Sabapati Swami fits into that chronology. How long had Kailash been considered a place you could go to, and that was, you know, desirable to go to on earth by the time he made that claim? And just for a little more context, in the book I wrote about the reception history of the Yoga Sutra, Krishnamacharya and his, well, actually it's his son, makes the claim that Krishnamacharya traveled to Kailash several times from Dharamsala, but via Muktinath in Nepal, so a very circuitous route, and he did it every 3 months or so, which is almost the same as flying there, because these are the most rugged mountains in the world, and you can't do it. But anyway, he too, South Indian guru, making these claims about Kailash, and I just wondered what the connections are. That wasn't a question. The question was about the accessories, and if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, you know, it's a really great question. You see it in all of Sabapati's diagrams, you know, where he's sort of, you know, in meditation, he has these instruments and implements that are around him. And, you know, like the kamandalu, you know, the water pot is sort of a, you know, token expression of that. But there's also the yoga danda, right? The stick that's prop that's very popular. In fact, I was able to purchase a yoga danda in Sabapati's guru's tumulus, as you say, the Jiva Samadhi, and he was sort of, those were for sale there. And so I think there is sort of an emphasis on implements that are used among yogis, possibly in South India, that, you know, is kind of more common. I wouldn't say, you know, another insight that I would have to that is in the temple culture and in the pujas that I've experienced and witnessed as part of the, you know, ethnographic fieldwork, you know, that, you know, I've undertaken, there are kind of a variety of implements that are used ritually for the consecration of the Shiva Linga. And we know that sort of yogis in many of his diagrams, he's sort of projecting the svarupa of the linga onto the body as a kind of meditation. And so my idea would be either that these implements are to assist in sort of the externalization of this ritual of the puja for Shiva's linga, or it's for the sadhu or the yogi to use, you know, him or herself in the consecration or in the ritual actions of, you know, consecrating the linga.
Those sound like two good explanations.
Okay, it's something I need to look into more. It's a fantastic question. I mean, the art history dynamic there is probably, you know, really important.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So I have a question, Keith. Thank you for a very rich, ethnographically and historically documented presentation. I feel like we've just seen the tip of an iceberg here, and it's really tremendous. And I was very interested in your differentiation between the local, the mesolocal, and the translocal components in it. And in that regard, there's a couple of questions. One is the role in print culture as a dynamic factor in that, as opposed to what existed beforehand. And how widely was this print culture being used by yogins at this time? Is he a standout, or is he representative of a trend at the time? And the other question had to deal with mobility. How did he get around to all these places? Is it the British railroad system, or is he walking, or, you know, how is he doing this? Because I think that's another dynamic here. In other words, how colonially based is this yogic tradition?
Sure. So I can answer the first question or the last question first, since I just have, let's see if I can share this screen here. So you'll notice on this map here, I have charted out the main railroad routes in 1883. And so it's clear, yeah, it's clear that these were, you know, places that he was able to get around via rail. However, some of these temple sites in the north, you know, and this links back to sort of David's point above, you know, you would have had to really walk or hike up to these mountain temple areas. You know, they were really off the beaten track. But as far as the urban areas, you know, these were linked by rail, you know, by 1883. Although to get into some of the mountainous areas too in South India, like the Podigai Malai, I've been hiking around there, and it's not easy to get to. I mean, it's not far from the truth to assume that he was really hiking through, forest and jungle like that. So at the same time, I mean, this gets into the transmission of the knowledge, right? That gets to the question of the print culture. And I was struck when looking at some of the publishers for his material that I was able to find early references to them in, I'm forgetting the scholar's first name, but Orsini. Orsini has this history of the book, I think in South Asia. And many of these publishers are sort of right at the beginning of when, print culture is starting to take off in India. And I would say Sabapati, in terms of yoga, as he even claims in one of his writings that this book is really the first of its kind. Like this book really hasn't been, this kind of book, like describing yoga in practical terms, has not been published before. And this is repeated in his Bengali works as well. And one final anecdote to this is that when I was talking about this material with a Tamil scholar at the Tamil Virtual Academy, they have an academy that's digitizing all of these print publications. And he really helped me track down one edition of one of these Tamil works. And Sitanai, which is his name, Sitanai really was struck by the fact that Sabapati was one of the first to really use, print culture to sort of unite disparate factions of Hinduism during that time. And possibly, the manuscript cultures were, disseminating, to a certain degree where different temples would hold different manuscripts, to be sacred, or the text in a given manuscript. But Sabapati was able to use print culture to sort of unite, certain instructions for, the rituals towards different gods and goddesses, and so on and so on. So I would say he has like one foot in kind of some of these oral instructions from gurus, and also borrowing clearly from ideas that are reflected in medieval manuscripts, but then also one foot definitely in kind of the colonial print culture of the time, and innovating in that way. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. So just one follow-up on this. So one of the languages he published in was Urdu. So can you explain that? Are we dealing with like Urdu-speaking Hindus, or is he really trying to bridge across religious divides there and make it accessible to people in the Muslim cultures or Sufi traditions and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the Urdu, it's just a pamphlet, and it only exists in one copy at the British Library. And I don't read Urdu, but I had a friend look over it and she said that it was basically, follows the account, this biographical account of Sabapati's life in English, and it was published by the Theosophical Society. So it was a branch of the Theosophical Society. So it was for, a readership, either a Muslim or a Hindu audience, we could say. And it was really just an account of his life, I think, for interested individuals who had probably heard about him at Lahore, heard about his presence and were interested to know more. Yeah.
So I have a question. So you showed this on one of your kind of overviews. So you talk about, you've got the local, the mesolocal, the translocal, but you also mentioned in one of your charts that you showed us, you also mentioned the relocalization. And could you talk a little bit about the distinction between mesolocal and relocalization, where you have this kind of vernacular inflections of Sabapati's works in Bengali, Hindustani, Telugu, Marathi, and so on? What do you, in terms of your thinking about levels, where's the relocalization? I clearly linked to the mesolocal, but how does it fit into your system of levels?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Barbara. So here's the slide where I do talk about that. It got me all the way to the beginning, but let me just see if I can pull that up. It's right
I remember
here.
you showed that, and I know you talked about it in your dissertation. I think to have you talk a little bit about that in terms of how you think about it.
It's playing it from the beginning, but I can keep it right here. So yeah, so relocalization, is an idea that I was sort of struggling to, it came out of the fact that I was struggling as to how to qualify or categorize, especially his Bengali work, which was a translation. And it's clearly a translation of his English work. And there's a translator, his name is Ambika Choron. And Ambika Choron translates from an English work that has Romanized Sanskrit terms, and then it's relocalized for a Bengali audience, though, by translating also songs that Sabapati had composed or Sri Chandra Boshu had written in English, and then making them, into Bengali, rendering them into Bengali with their own meters, and also making mention of Bengali figures like Chaitanya, who you know very well, Chaitanya, the Bengali Vaishnava reformer. And so my idea is that relocalization can also be a way that ideas can travel from, I guess, a translocal strata of text, right? I mean, we have this idea that if a text on yoga is going to travel, let's say is going to be composed in Bengali, the expectation of the text being composed in Bengali is normally that it would sort of contain, local concerns on the ground that are related to, say, local religious practices, in the context of, say, Bengali Tantra or Bengali, yogic techniques, whether that be Hatha Yoga or Raja Yoga. But in this case, in Sabapati's works, you have a text on yoga that's being translated from English. And so how do we describe that as a relocalization, or how do we describe that as, a local or mesolocal or translocal? It's kind of in between in a sort of way.
Mhm.
And so I like to see it as a relocalization. And in some other cases, you have relocalization from the local movement. And I like to see that as sort of students in a specific single, area of India. And this is related to, there's a segment of Sabapati's trilingual work that's in English, Devanagari, and Tamil. But then in the last few pages, he has like 10 pages or so in Marathi. And it's like a synopsis of his instructions in the Marathi language. And so here, it's really hard for me to categorize that excerpt of the text as well, right? Since it's not necessarily a local Marathi yogic tradition that's being expressed in the Marathi language. It's actually some of the mesolocal content that already contains English and Sanskrit, and then it's sort of translated into Marathi. Does that make sense? That's where
Yeah.
sort of I came up with relocalization to sort of account for that. But yeah, I can see it's.
No, I think
Yeah.
it's helpful though. It's helpful. That distinction is important, I think. Can you also just tell us how did you end up focusing in on this figure? I mean, you have a really broad background. You've done a lot of work in Bengal, Bengali traditions and songs and so on. You translate, I co-edited, a volume of Bengali songs that were translated by Carolyn Solomon. How did you get to this figure? I mean, I know you came in with this interest, but can you just share with others? How do you end up with this focus on such a person? And then what kind of tracks did you follow? Where did you begin?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had first read Sabapati Swami's name in the works of the occultist Aleister Crowley. And so I knew, I knew about him, but I just, thought, like, I think anyone who would just pick up his English work on Vedanta and Raja Yoga, you just kind of think, okay, this is just a single work that has to do with, Vedanta and the Brahman, and maybe it's sort of, a neo-Vedantic work. I mean, who knows, right? Like where some of these ideas are coming from, but it didn't seem necessarily, it didn't strike me as having a lot of depth, right, or grounding in kind of a local religious context, even though there is some mention of Tamil and Sanskrit and so on. But what really changed for me was, I had some friends here in Seattle encouraging me to look into it more. And what happened as I started to see in his English work, Vedanta and Raja Yoga, there's a mention of a work that he composed in Tamil, and it has this name, the Raja Yoga Brahma Jnana Anubhuti. And I started to search in the library searches here at University of Washington, and sure enough, I came in contact with his Hindustani work, in the Hindi language, with all these extra diagrams and new material. And then I started to think, hey, there's actually like a whole world here that's not really, being talked about or sort of uncovered. And so I started to move in that direction as I became interested in sort of the wider intersections between, the local religious context that I was encountering in Bengal, like among the Baul fakirs, and so on. There's also an intersection at these different levels. And Sabapathy very much sort of easily and conveniently reflects, I think, all of these levels. And so, yeah, it was natural to sort of see this blend, hey, if we just focus on the translocal occultism, we're not going to really, get into the wealth of material on the ground. And so I saw this sort of unexplored world and went for it. Yeah.
So that's very interesting. So you did start with the occult. That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
Crowley. Yeah. That's good. So, and you've presented this. And it's interesting again, and this is also for the broader audience here. What's important about your work. I mean, obviously, you're making significant contributions to studies of early modern yoga. You're putting on the map this neglected figure was so important on all these levels, as you've shown. But you could do, and you have, right? I mean, in a certain sense, your book will track all these different levels and the contributions of this figure. But have you presented on, like at the Western esotericism groups at the AR, you've presented about him, and you could present about the South Asia group and the Hinduism's group, and I mean, that's what's interesting about this figure. Such an important figure. The fact that, and some student was saying to me, "Oh, there's nothing in India that." For a dissertation topic, everything's been done. I said, are you kidding me? India, I mean, there's all these worlds that remain to be excavated, the kind of work that you've done. There are many other figures probably somewhere buried in these various works, whose voices have been kind of lost sight of, but with diligent research scholars, we'll hear more about them.
Mm-hmm.
But you presented about this figure, right, in multiple contexts already?
I have,
So,
yes. The different there's different societies devoted to the study of esotericism, as well as at the AAR conference, sort of on the more sort of South Asia side, yogic material as well. And I see there's a comment in the chat from Jesse, so I would like to address that.
Yeah, you want to read the comment and then?
Yeah, so Jesse's asking that he saw in one publication that Sabapathy was given the title Mauna Guru, and could you comment on the attainment of this title within the hagiography, and if there are direct linkages made to prior adepts through that title? And yeah, so Mauna Guru is definitely a title that's recurrent in Sabapathy's works. It refers to this attainment of silence and this sort of silent experience of Śivarājayoga. And there's even these stanzas and poems that he composed that are rendered in both Devanagari and Tamil that refer to the attainment of this mauna, this state of silence. As far as the earlier adepts who have sort of used this, I don't know of any previous to Sabapathy, but I do know that it's recurrent in some of the Tamil Siddhar yoga literature. Some of them use this term mauna. For instance, I've heard it in one of Sabapathy's sort of contemporaries to a little later, Sargurunatha Swamigal, who there's been a short documentary made about him in Tamil that I can share with you if you like, but he sort of has a similar hagiography, of being an avatar of Augusta, and he he makes use, I've seen in his works of this Mauna, I do believe. But as far as others, I don't know. Yeah.
Great. Any other comments or questions? I know, Keith, you have some deadline that's pressing upon you. Do you want to take a couple more questions, or do you want to bring it to closure at this point?
I can take one more question if you'd like.
Any other questions? Anya Foxon was here. I think though she left. I was wondering if she left a little comment in the chat. So okay. All right. Well, it looks like we can bring this to closure, but thank you so much, Keith. It's really been amazing to see you display just even a few moments within this incredible work. And we look forward to seeing it brought to fruition in a publication not too far away, not too far in the future. I don't even know how to talk anymore. Been in COVID for too long. But anyway, so thank you. Really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for coming. And we look forward to seeing you. Actually, we're going to, a couple of weeks, we're going to have another South Asia event, which I'll let everyone know about. But hope to see everyone again soon.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And thank you for hosting this. And many thanks to you and David and the rest of the committee for all of your support throughout this all. Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye. And one more thing is that I'll also this has been recorded, so I'll plan to post it on YouTube, if that's okay, for
Sure.
any, possible parties, if you all don't want that, then I can just send it to friends individually. But I had a few friends who were interested to hear it, so I don't know how you feel about that. But yeah, it's okay
Don't
to
hear
post
any
it.
and no
Okay.
objections. No
All right,
objections.
objections. All right.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And we'll see everyone soon.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.